Okay, that was loading for over an hour. But it is finally over, so we're ready to explore the Nessus tool. It is pretty simple to use. Your page should be blank since you haven't performed any scan yet. So we can click right here on this X button just to see better this page. And all we want to do from here is go to the new scan button. Right here, we will see all of the available options that we can do for our scans. So we got basic network scan, as it says a full system scan suitable for any host. We got the advanced scan, configure a scan without using any recommendations, and we got a bunch of the other options, and for some of them we need the Nessus Professional version in order to use, such as this one, this one, this one, and all of these that have the upgrade on them. Now, as I already talked about, with Nessus Essentials, we're only going to be able to scan local IP addresses. Inside of a company, you could use this tool to scan their networks for vulnerabilities. However, you cannot scan an external IP address with this. So scanning a website is not going to work, unless it's inside of your network. Another thing to remind you is that we can scan with the free version up to 16 IP addresses. And if I'm not mistaken, those 16 IP addresses clean after 90 days, so after 90 days you will be able to scan more IP addresses, but I'm not sure about that. And if you have a free version and you have more than 16 targets, you will have to scan that network with multiple Nessus scans. So, scanning big enterprise networks for big companies will require Nessus Professional version. But what we want to do here, to learn Nessus and how to use it, we want to go onto the basic network scan. And this basic scan will require us to specify some options. Now, for our first scan, we'll be scanning only Metasploitable. So, turn it on if you haven't already. Check out the IP address of Metasploitable. In my case, it is 192.168.1.4. And once you do that, we can proceed to specify our options. In the General tab, under the name, you can specify anything you want. I will simply just type Metasploitable. Under the description, I will just leave this empty, there is nothing really to specify here. You can put anything you want here, just so you can recognize which type of scan you did and on which target you did it. In the folder, we will leave it on My Scans, and in the targets, we specify the IP address of our target machine. Since right now we are only scanning one machine, we will specify the IP address of Metasploitable. But if you were to scan a network, you would specify something like this: 192.168.1.1/24, in case it is a /24 network. I believe you can also specify it like this, so dash 192.168.1.255. But right now, let us just go with our Metasploitable. And with the free version, we can't even scan 255 hosts. Remember, we can only scan 16. Once you specify this, we want to proceed to the Schedule tab. And here, this Schedule tab is useful once you want to schedule your scans on a certain period of time, or you just want to schedule a scan while you're doing something else on the side. For now, we're going to leave it off. Under the notifications, you can choose if you want to send results to some emails over SMTP server. We're not going to be doing that right now. In the Discovery tab, this is the important stuff. Here we choose how many and which ports we want to scan. We have an option of scanning common ports, and this is similar to Nmap default port scan. It will only scan most popular ports. Or you can select scan all ports, which we're going to use right now, to scan all 65,000 ports on our Metasploitable. And if you want, there is a custom option, which is the third option right here, but we're pretty satisfied with this scan all ports option. If we read the settings, the general settings always test the Nessus localhost, use fast network discovery. Under the port scanner settings, we have scan all ports, use netstat if credentials are provided, use SYN scanner if necessary, and we're pinging hosts using TCP, ARP, and ICMP. Good. Once you set this to scan all ports, you can go to the assessment, and in the assessment tab, we can choose what we want to scan for. So there are a few options. If I click right here on the scan type, we have scan for known web vulnerabilities, scan for all web vulnerabilities, and scan for all web vulnerabilities complex. For the purposes of this tutorial, we will be scanning for known web vulnerabilities. Why? Well, this will just take lesser time to finish. When you run scan for complex web vulnerabilities, it usually takes a lot more time. And we can see right here under the general settings, avoid potential false alarms, enable CGI scanning, and web applications, we will crawl up to 1000 pages, up to 6 directories, and we will test for known vulnerabilities in commonly used web applications. These are our assessment settings. But also keep in mind that if we discover some web vulnerabilities, we will see how to attack them in the web penetration testing section. That will come right after the exploitation section. For now, let us just see whether Nessus will find something juicy. Right after, we go to the report settings, and usually you want to leave this on default, so we're not going to be changing anything right here. And finally, in the advanced tab, we will leave it on default for now and proceed to click on save. So click on save right here, and you should have your scan right here. Now, you will notice that it does not automatically start. We must launch it. And we do that by clicking on this arrow right here, which says launch. Click on it. In just a few seconds, here it is. These green arrows will start spinning and our scan has officially started. This will try to discover all the vulnerabilities it can find for the metasploitable machine. Now, keep in mind that these scans can take a lot longer than Nmap scans. You can always check the current state of scan by clicking on the scan name, in our case on the metasploitable, and you will be able to see what it managed to find for now during the scan. Different vulnerabilities will be marked with different colors. We will have blue color, which means information disclosure, and what that is it possibly managed to find some information that should be private, or it managed to find the service version or something similar that allows us to find out more information about the target. It doesn't necessarily mean that the information is useful though. Then we have green, yellow and orange vulnerabilities, or also known as low, medium and high vulnerabilities. And at the end we get the most interesting vulnerabilities, which are critical vulnerabilities. This usually includes remote code execution or something similar. So what you can also do, you can click on them, and this is just what it managed to find at this current point of scan. So we got one critical vulnerability for now, we got two mixed vulnerabilities, one medium vulnerability, and some information disclosure right here. Let's go back, and we're going to wait for this to finish, and once it's done, we will get back to it and see the results. Alright, it is finally over, and we can see, if I click on the scan, that it managed to discover a bunch of vulnerabilities. All kinds of them. Let us go through these results and see some of the vulnerabilities it found. Remember, we are most interested in critical and high vulnerabilities. Others can also be useful, but these two are the main ones. First thing we see is that it managed to find 7 critical vulnerabilities, 11 high vulnerabilities, 36 medium vulnerabilities, 7 low, and 148 information disclosure. Let us click on the scan. Right here we can order the vulnerabilities by their severity. So if I click on this arrow, it will go from the information to the critical, but mostly we are interested in critical vulnerabilities, so I will click it once again, and let's go with any one of them. We're going to see an example of each vulnerability. We're going to check one critical, one high, one medium, one low, and one information disclosure. Let's go, for example, with this one. So it says NFS exported share information disclosure. This is a critical vulnerability. Down here we can see the description, and it says at least one of the NFS shares exported by the remote server could be mounted by the scanning host. An attacker may be able to leverage this to read and possibly write files on remote host. It tells us what is the solution to fix this vulnerability, as it says configure NFS on the remote host, so that only authorized hosts can mount its remote shares. Down here it tells us where it found the vulnerability. It found it on our metasploitable on the 2049 UDP port. And what you would do, for example, is you would then Google this vulnerability, which we learned in the previous video where we covered Googling vulnerabilities and search exploit, and you would see how you would exploit this. For now, we know that this exists. Let's check another critical vulnerability. Let's go, for example, onto this one, bind shell backdoor detection. It says a shell is listening on a remote port without any authentication being required. An attacker may use it by connecting to the remote port and sending commands directly. This seems like a really big problem. And we're going to see in the next section how we can actually gain access from this critical vulnerability. It is very, very easy, trust me. But these types of misconfiguration happen often. Down here we can see the solution, verify the remote host has been compromised and reinstall the system if necessary. And the actual vulnerability is found on the port 1524 over TCP. Now, since critical vulnerabilities are most important, let us check another one. Let's go on to this one. VNC server password is password. So it seems that we get the default credentials for some software running on our Metasploitable. As it says, the VNC server running on the remote host is secured with a weak password. And this type of vulnerability is something that you will find the most. Now, it doesn't have to be anything connected to the VNC server, but weak credentials are something that even the biggest companies have. And you can have all the security in the world, but if your password is weak, none of that security will matter. Down here we see the Nessus logged in using a password. And what port was it on? It was port 5900 over TCP. So we will see how we can exploit all of this, but let us also check out some other vulnerabilities as well. Apache Tomcat AGP connector request injection. Let's click on it. This seems to be a high vulnerability, and it tells us a file read inclusion vulnerability was found in AGP connector. A remote unauthenticated attacker could exploit this vulnerability to read web application files from a vulnerable server. It tells us that the solution is to actually upgrade the Tomcat server to the newer version. And down here it tells us over which port did it find the vulnerability, which is port 8009. On the right side we can also see some additional vulnerability information, such as what is the vulnerability for. It is for Apache Tomcat. Is the exploit available? Yes, the exploit exists for this, and they are available. The patch was published on March 1st, 2020. And vulnerability was also published on that same day, and Nessus managed to successfully exploit it. Reference information, and here are the vulnerability names. So you would just type this, search for an exploit for it, and you would manage to exploit the Metasploitable machine. Let's check out a few more vulnerabilities, and then we're going to wrap up with this tutorial. Let's go to a medium one, and let's go, for example, to this one, SMB sign-in not required. Sign-in is not required on the remote SMB server. An authenticated remote attacker can exploit this to conduct man-in-the-middle attacks against the SMB server. Now, we have not covered man-in-the-middle yet, but later in the course we will be devoting an entire section to this attack, to the man-in-the-middle attack. So for now, we just know that the SMB port, which is running on port 445, is vulnerable to the man-in-the-middle attacks. Okay, let us also check out some information disclosure. So right here we can see OpenSSL detection, service detection, GET request, SSL TLS version supported. So we can check out which SSL and TLS versions are supported. This plugin detects which SSL and TLS versions are supported by the remote service for encrypting communications. And this port seems to be running SSL version 2, SSL version 3, and TLS version 1. And these are just different protocols used for encryption of the data that is being transferred over this port. And once again, you will see that SSL is vulnerable to the man-in-the-middle attack. We can decrypt this data using that specific attack. However, don't worry if you fully don't understand what I'm talking about. This is once again something that we will cover in a later section. Okay, great. Do you see right now how amazing this Nessus scanner is? It literally gave us most of the vulnerabilities just from a single scan. In the next section we will see how to exploit most of these vulnerabilities on the Metasploitable, but on other targets as well. In the next video we're going to scan other machine using Nessus, and we're going to see what results we get. See you in the next. Welcome back. In this video, I want to show you another example of an SS scan. So in the previous one, we scanned our Metasploitable, which is a Linux machine. Right now, we're going to see what results can we get scanning a Windows machine. So I have right here Windows 7 virtual machine, and what's special about this machine is that it hasn't been updated in a year. And keep in mind, there are a lot of people in the world that don't regularly update their operating systems. This machine specifically doesn't have any additional software installed and running on open ports. The only open ports it has are these ones, and most of them are open by default once you install Windows 7. Let us see what our NAS scan will manage to find on an unupdated Windows 7 machine. So let's go right here and go on to new scan. We already know how we can perform the scan, so I will not be explaining the details. We navigate to the basic scan and we can type right here Windows 7. The IP address I checked out right here, it is 192.168.1.6, and if I scan it, go to the discovery, we can scan all ports. In the assessment, we're going to scan for known web vulnerabilities. In the report, we leave everything default, and in the advanced, we leave it on default. I will click on save, and I will just run my scan. This will start scanning my Windows 7 machine, and in a few minutes we will receive the entire scan and all the vulnerabilities it managed to find for our Windows 7 machine. Once again, keep in mind that it doesn't have any additional software installed. I just installed an operating system and connected it to my network. Let's wait for the scan to finish, and we're going to see what it will manage to find. Okay, the scan has finished. Let us check out the results that NAS gave us. If I click on my Windows 7, we will see it managed to find 4 critical vulnerabilities and 2 high vulnerabilities. And these are the vulnerabilities it found on Windows machine that hasn't been updated. Let us check them out. If I click on this and click on Microsoft Windows multiple issues, we will see 4 critical vulnerabilities. Unsupported Windows OS. This means that the Windows has not been updated, as it says right here, is either missing a service packet or is no longer supported. This simply means it hasn't been updated in a while. As a result, it is likely to contain security vulnerabilities, and that is true. We get the MS14, which it says right here, vulnerability in channel could allow remote code execution, uncredentialed check. And down here, we also get what type of vulnerability it is. So we could just search for that vulnerability, search for an exploit, and gain access to our Windows 7 machine. We also get this RDP, RCE, or also known as the Blue Keep attack. And as you can see right here, this attack is relatively new. It's from 2019. So for example, if there was anyone running Windows 7 that hasn't updated their machine since 2019, they are vulnerable to this attack. This attack exploits Remote Desktop Protocol, which is running over the port 3389. Cool, right? We managed to discover vulnerabilities and critical vulnerabilities for the Windows 7 machine. This NAS tool is really amazing. However, there are also some vulnerabilities that it didn't manage to find. And I'm talking about really high vulnerabilities. So it is finally time. In the next section, we're going to see how we can exploit a bunch of these vulnerabilities, how we can gain access to the target, steal information from the target. We will see also how we can maintain access on the target, and we will see how we can cover our tracks. See you in the exploitation section. Welcome back. In this and in the next video, I want to talk about something different. We attacked different machines, from Windows machines to Linux machines, but in these 2 videos, I want to show you that you can also target your own router, or the router from the network that you are attacking. Now, it might seem that it is not that important to test your router, but once you gain access to the router, you pretty much have the control over the entire network. And not only that, gaining access to the router is powerful. It means that you can change different network settings, that you can forward different ports and so on and so on, the routers are also the easiest devices to hack. You might be asking, why? Well, because usually 90% of home routers and home devices have default login passwords. The vendors who provide homes with their routers never really change the default password, and default password is something that you can find on the internet. These default password attacks we're going to check out in the next tutorial, but for this one I want to show you a cool tool that you can use to test on your own router to check out whether it is vulnerable to some exploits. So just type in your search bar routersploit and it will lead you to this GitHub link where we will have our routersploit tool. Now we already know how to download all of these GitHub tools, so let's copy the link straight away, navigate to our desktop, and we can git clone routersploit. While this is copying, let's go down to the installation commands just to see how we can install this tool properly, and here we have installation on Kali Linux and all of the commands that we must run. So we must install python3.pip, even though I believe we already have this. Let's run the command just to make sure, and it requires root privileges, so let's enter the root account first and let's type the same command, apt-get install python3.pip. Everything is installed. Let's move on to the next command. We already did the git clone. Let's change the directory to routersploit. And the next command is python3 and then install the requirements. As we can see inside of the routersploit directory, we have requirements.txt file. And whenever you have this requirements.txt, we already know that we must run this command to install all of the requirements from that file. Let's press enter. As soon as it installs all of these files that it needs, we should be ready to run the routersploit tool, which is this rsf.py. Okay, so everything has finished, and let's python3 rsf.py. And you will notice that once you run this tool, it will open something that looks similar to the MSF console. We get this command line type, and here we can execute different commands. It says right here that it has 132 exploits, 4 scanners, 171 credential attacks, 4 generic attacks, 32 payloads, and 6 encoders. Now, to check out all of the available commands, we can run help command, and it will tell us how to use a certain module, how to execute a shell command argument, and here we can also search for different tools. Now, if I type search scanners, it will give us all of the 4 scanners that it has. And in this video, we're going to use this AutoPWN scanner. This will test for all the exploits from the routersploit tool onto our target router to see whether it is vulnerable to any one of them. So let's type use scanners and then AutoPWN. Once you select it, you can type help, or pardon me, you can type show options, the same way that we do inside of the MSF console, and the only thing that we must set is target IP address. To do that, we can type set target 192.168.1.1. This is the router in my case. If you want to check out your gateway or your router, you can type the command netstat-nr, and under the gateway, you will have the IP address of your gateway. Once you check it out, type it right here, and as soon as you set your IP address, you can type run. As it says, it will start the vulnerability check, and it will go through all of these exploits and see whether your router is vulnerable to any one of them. If you have this minus sign, that means that the router is not vulnerable. If you have this star sign, that means that routersploit cannot really determine whether your router is vulnerable to this security threat. As it says right here, it could not be verified. And if you have a plus sign, which we don't have at the moment, that means it found a security vulnerability for your router. In my case, I believe I don't have any at the moment, but you might find some vulnerability for the router. Let's wait for this scan to finish. And it is done. It says could not confirm any vulnerability and it couldn't find default credentials. And this part right here is not exactly true. We're going to check out default credentials in the next video. However, you can test these exploits with the router exploit tool. You can also check out these ones that says could not verify exploitability. This could possibly mean that they are vulnerable to these attacks, or this exploit is simply just not the type of exploit that targets your router. Okay, now that we covered the router exploit tool, we're going to see how we can gain access to the router with the default credentials vulnerability that at least 70 to 80% of home routers have. See you in the next video. Welcome back. Time to check out the default credentials vulnerability on your router. Now, this tutorial is something that you cannot follow, because this is going to be different for every type of router that someone has. I can just show you the process of how I went and discovered the default credentials, and you can try to do the same thing in order to see whether you can gain access to your router. So the first thing that I did is I typed netstat-nr to check out the IP address of my gateway, which is most likely going to be the IP address of your router. Then I went to Google Chrome and visited that IP address. If you do the same for your router, it will most likely lead you to some type of a login page where it will ask you for the username and the password. Once you type the username and the password, you will have access to the router settings and you will be able to change a few things here and there, from setting up wireless to port forwarding and similar settings like that. Now, if you haven't changed the default password for your router, you will most likely be able to find it on the internet. Which I did. I just searched the name of the router that I have right here and I found the username to be telecom and password to be telecom. Nobody changed this username and password, therefore they're exactly the same. And we even get this warning that says a data breach on a site or app exposed your passwords. Chrome recommends changing your password for this IP address now. We're going to click on OK and pretty much we already gained access to the router settings. We can set up the firewall, VLAN settings, we can check out different settings that we have right here. We have some security settings right here. We also get the port forwarding, which we can perform. And this is something that I tested on multiple home routers and many of them appear to have default credentials where it allows you to log into the router and change these type of settings. But these are not the only default credentials that you can find. For example, if I go right here and I run an nmap scan with -st command on my router IP address, I will also discover that it has some ports open. For example, it has this telnet port open. We already know how we can connect to the telnet. We can type the command telnet and then the IP address of the target that we want to connect to. If I press enter, we will get another login screen. So if I type something like telecom, once again, it will tell me that the password is incorrect. So after 3 attempts, it simply just closes the connection to the router. And I figured, well, if the router default credentials weren't changed, then probably I can find the telnet credentials as well on the internet. And after a few minutes of Googling, I ran across this website where I scrolled a little bit down and I found this post that was posted by someone. It says my router name, which is this one, and we can compare it right here. It is the same name. And we get the username and password. We also get how we can enable the shell inside of that router. So let's give it a try. The username is admin and the password is this. Let's go and run telnet once again. Type username to be admin and password to be ztonpk. And here it is. We're inside of CLI. Now, the next thing that this person does is it types enable. Then it enters the password of ZTE and then it enables shell. Let's give it a try. If I type enable, type ZTE, and then shell, another login attempt. But luckily, this person also provided us with username and password for that. This is something that we will most likely never be able to brute force in case we didn't know, because this is a really strong username and strong password. However, it is default one, and this is something that we can find on the internet. For your router, of course, this will not be the same, but you can go through the same process of searching for the default credentials. Just figure out the name of your router, type it in Google, and try to find some default credentials. For example, we notice that I have open port SSH and Telnet. You might be able to target SSH and not Telnet, or you might be able to target some different port. It could all depend on your router. However, now I'm targeting Telnet, and let's go and type in the username and password that this person sent us. So I have it written on my left screen, and I will type FNNSD3ZX HNH168NV31. For some reason it says bad username. Let's try once again. Maybe we typed something incorrectly. So let's go admin, password, let's enable. The password is ETE, and let's go into shell. Here we want to type FNNSD3ZX HNH168NV31, which is the login, and the password is ZXHNH168NV31. And here we are. We are inside of the shell. If I type ls, we're going to be able to see the files on our router. I can type the ifconfig command to be able to see all of the interfaces that our router has. Here the first interface has the IP address of 192.168.1.1, and down here we're also going to be able to find the public IP address, which is right here. Okay, great. We have gained access to the router. We can also go and change directories to different directories if we want to. We can run different commands that you can usually run from your terminal, and that's how you can gain access to your router with default credentials. Now give it a try on your own router. Try searching the name of the router. First try logging into this page right here, which will grant you an access to some of the router settings. And even if you don't manage to do that, try scanning your router with Nmap, figure out whether it has some interesting ports open, and then target those ports with default credentials that you might manage to find online, just like I did right here. Okay, now that we covered this, we're ready to continue with our exploitation section. See you in the next video. Welcome back. We have covered several things for now when it comes to network security. We talked a little about network firewalls, we saw how we can scan network with Nmap and use tools such as Nessus to discover any vulnerabilities. Now, vulnerability analysis and exploitation is once again more advanced topic, which you can find in the ZTM ethical hacking course if that's what you're interested in. Besides that, we also saw how we can perform vulnerability analysis onto our router, which is one of the most important devices inside of our network when it comes to security. And essentially, all of these things make our network more safe. We can list out all the topics that we mentioned at some point of the course, which can also refer to network security. Installing firewall, both host-based and network-based, can help secure your network. Now, as we mentioned, network firewalls are most likely to be found in a company network and might not be needed if you're trying to secure just your own home network. Another topic we covered in the endpoint security section that can help in network security is antivirus softwares. Now, it is common sense that if your antivirus software prevents a malware from running on your machine, that it also prevented a threat on the entire network, since we don't really know what that malware's purpose is. It might try to search for other vulnerabilities on the network and exploit other devices there, and antivirus is a good layer that might be able to stop it. Another important thing which we talked about is updating your firmware, especially on your router, since it is an important thing to do. Sometimes it's done automatically, but in many cases you have to do it manually. Besides this, we talked multiple times throughout the course about default passwords. You must always change the default passwords, whether they being the passwords for a login page or for your router access, or perhaps a password for accessing services such as FTP, SSH and others. You always should change default password, and we saw the reason why when we covered the router vulnerability analysis. With just a little bit of googling for my specific router, once we googled, we managed to find the default passwords for certain services. Okay. Another big topic we mentioned are performing vulnerability analysis and penetration testing onto your own network or onto your company network. There is no better way to discover vulnerabilities than to purposely try and find them. And that's where penetration testing and tools like Nmap, Nessus, MSF Console, and others come in play. Another thing that we mentioned at the beginning of the course when we talked about assets is to always back up your data. Now, it's not possible to 100% secure everything, and there will probably be a time when you will have a breach. But in these cases, it is important that you have all your data backed up in case it gets destroyed by, let's say, a malware or a ransomware or any type of threat at all. And last but not least is to always train the employees, whether them being employees of the company you work for or of your own company. They should always have basic security education if they are interacting with important components of your network and of your business. But besides these, there are a few more things that you can do. For example, when it comes to your router, it is not just important to change its password and to update its firmware. It's also important that you have a good router. What do I mean by that? Well, many home networks have old routers that barely even update anymore and that could have bunch of vulnerabilities just because they are old and there are certain things that cannot be updated. If you have an old router, it might be a good time to get a new one and a better one. Also, manufacturers build and distribute these network devices such as routers with exploitable softwares just so they can have ease of installation, operation and maintenance. These common types of routers are also main target of the attackers since they are widely distributed, so it might not be a bad idea to get a device from some less known vendor considering that it's well made and secured. Another thing is that many services inside the network come with default passwords, but they also come with default settings. Many of these softwares don't have their settings configured to the most secure ones, and that is probably for easier use. This can present a threat if some important security measure is off, so it's always important when installing a new software inside the network to check its security settings just to see if they can be set to more secure options. Another thing that you want to do, usually in company networks, is network segmentation. This, if set properly, can prevent an intruder from executing exploits and laterally moving around the network. If it's poorly set, the attacker could extend their impact and gain control of multiple devices and not just one. Now, there are multiple types of segmentations of network, but first and most obvious one is physical separation of devices. You don't want your important devices with all of your important data set in a room where many people can access it and where many people can connect to the same network where that device is. And even if they are connected to the same network, you want to give least privileges to devices that you do not trust so they don't have much access to the network. Another form of separation is using VLANs to isolate users from the rest of the domains. This virtual type of separation is logically separating different devices on the same physical network. Now, next thing to keep an eye on is something we already mentioned, which is setting privileges inside the network. This refers mostly again to company networks where you want to have network administrator and you don't want regular users trying to execute unauthorized commands or anything that is not in their privilege level. If they do try, however, with well-set privilege settings, the command should be rejected. This of course makes administrator credentials more valuable, so all the accounts should have multi-factor authentication, so it makes it harder for intruders to gain access to administrator privileges, or administrator credentials in this case, and start performing malicious things on the network. The company network can have a special server that provides authentication, authorization, and accounting services to store access information for network device management. The passwords of accounts that are being stored in databases should be all hashed and salted, and also it is a good idea to have them in a backup in a protected offline device. Another measure to take into consideration is to always verify integrity of hardware and software that is being implemented inside the network. Bigger companies do this usually by maintaining strict control of supply chain and purchases only from authorized resellers, and upon installation, inspecting all the devices for any sign of tampering. Usually, if you download a software, you also want to perform hash verification to see if that software itself has been modified during the download. Another thing that many companies do, and that refers back to our endpoint security section, is to harden the network devices. You pretty much want to go through all the security checks that we did in the endpoint security section to ensure that your devices have even more security. Now, bigger companies go over the head with this, but for a reason, and they end up installing a bunch of antivirus softwares, heavy firewalls, and hard disk encryptions, which end up making the device slower, but it's better to have a slower device than to have it compromised. For home networks, this type of security is not needed, however, you can always have light multiple security layers, just as we showed in the endpoint section, to increase your security overall. And last but not least, you also want to keep an eye on physical security. Remember what we talked about before. All these security measures, firewalls, antivirus softwares, penetration testing, and vulnerability analysis is useless if someone can just walk in and steal your device and all of your data, right? This is why it's important to also have physical security protecting your important assets. Nonetheless, these would be the basic steps to having a secure network architecture. Now, most of these topics we already researched. The ones that we didn't, you want to research even more. And if you end up implementing the things we mentioned in this lecture, you will 100% have more secure network. Does this mean that it will be unbreachable? No, since remember that 100% security is not possible, but we can always end up scaling up and making it more and more secure. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Here is another topic when it comes to network security, which is wireless security. Nowadays, almost all the networks have an access point, and every time we turn on our Wi-Fi on our phones, we will see a bunch of access points just ready for us to connect to them. This makes them one of the biggest targets when it comes to hacking. First of all, not all access points are the same. We can separate them by different type of security that they have, starting from WEP or WEP, then VPA, VPA2, and VPA3. Now, WEP was the first wireless security protocol that has been widely used. Today, WEP has a bunch of threats, and it is highly unlikely that you will ever come across an access point that still uses WEP. Nowadays, most common ones are WPA and WPA2. WPA was adopted as an alternative to WEP since WEP had a bunch of issues. WPA uses 256-bit encryption technology, and it first introduced WPA Personal for home wireless access points and WPA Enterprise for larger companies. The version 2 or WPA2 came with a little improvement when it added the Advanced Encryption Standard, also known as AES, which provides higher security and performance, but even WPA2 had some security issues. In 2018, WPA3 was introduced with some improvements in the protection against dictionary types of the attacks, which were common with WPA2. Another thing is Even in home networks, WPA3 will automatically encrypt the connection without any need for credentials which could be stolen. And out of all of them, even though WPA3 is rather new and it will take time for it to get its space in the industry, it is recommended to use it whenever you can. As far as the attacks and prevention against these attacks go, here are the two most common ones. The first one is called Evil Twin Attack. In normal use of an access point, a device will connect to an SSID that it wants to join, and after the credentials have been exchanged, the access point will grant access to that device to join the network. Now what an attacker does in this case is create his own fake access point with the same SSID and make sure he either has the stronger signal than the original access point or he comes closer to the target. This is because a device will automatically connect to the stronger access point that he sees with the same SSID in case the auto-connect option is on, which is the case for most of the devices. This will result into target connecting straight to the attacker's access point without the user of that device even noticing, which is once again the result of the access point having the same SSID, which is also the name of the access point, and it having the stronger signal than the original access point. Once the target connects to the fake access point, the attacker can then send a fake captive portal requiring the user to input the access point credentials for whatever reason. A little bit of social engineering comes in play here, but not that much since the target in 99.9% of cases won't suspect anything since they will think that they connected to their own access point that just requires credentials to continue using the internet. Once they input the credentials or the password, the attacker now knows the access point's password, and from here he can just log in to the original access point on his own. Now let's mention how can we prevent against this, or how can we protect against this. Well, there are several things we can keep an eye on to minimize chances of this attack. We can always only connect to our own hotspot or our own access point which we are familiar with. You can also avoid using unsecured hotspots that have no security at all and that are open for anyone to connect. You can also disable auto-connect on your device so your device doesn't automatically try to connect to a hotspot since it can connect to the fake one if the signal is stronger. If you have auto-connect off, you will have to go to your Wi-Fi settings and pick an access point from there. This way you will notice that there are two exact same access points with the exact same name, and you will know something isn't right and that a possible evil twin attack is taking place. Also, when you can, use VPN encrypted traffic just in case. This would be the first common attack and its preventions. The second attack is a typical brute force attack. Now, this is possible since attacker can steal the hashed value of the access point's credentials and brute force it until he gets that in plain text. In more details, it works like this. Let's say we have an access point with some devices connected to it, and we have a hacker that is not connected to the Wi-Fi at the moment. The only requirement for this is that the hacker is close to the Wi-Fi during the first part of the attack. An attacker can send something called deauthentication packets without being connected to the access point, which will then automatically disconnect the already connected devices from the Wi-Fi. Now, for an attacker to perform this attack, he must have a wireless card that supports monitor mode and packet injection. Not many wireless cards support this, but it's quite cheap to get an external one that is able to perform this type of the attack. The next step is, after deauthenticating the devices on the network, these devices will then try to reconnect to the access point by performing a four-way handshake where it exchanges the key. And at this very moment, the attacker will try to steal this handshake and store inside a file for later use. in this very file, if everything is done successfully, would be the hashed value of the access point's password. Here comes the hardest part, which brings us back to password security, and that is that the attacker must now brute force the hash in order to get the plaintext password. If you followed all the steps we taught at the beginning of the course, where we covered password security and showed an example of well-secure passwords, there is no way that any hacker will be able to brute force it. But if your password is weak, the attacker will get it in plain text in a matter of seconds. Keep in mind that these offline brute force attacks can cover millions, even hundreds of millions of passwords every single second, which you can imagine is quite a lot of combinations. If your password is weak or semi-weak, the attacker will eventually get it, and once he does, he can use that plaintext password to connect to the wireless access point on his own. Okay, now here are some of the preventions and how we can secure ourselves from this type of the attack. First thing, as usual, we want to change the default password if it is set. Sometimes vendors might come to set up the Wi-Fi and they put a default password which the user is then meant to change later but never does. This ends up being a problem since these default passwords are easily found on the internet, and if anyone wants to join the access point, they can do that with just a little bit of googling. Another step is to make password as strong as possible and as complex. This will make it impossible to brute force and get it in the plain text. And a more advanced security measure that you can do is to create a whitelist or a blacklist based on MAC addresses. Now, these type of settings are standard and you can usually find them inside your router settings where you configure the access point, but creating these can essentially block out anyone who tries to join the network but doesn't have a valid MAC address that belongs to the list. Nonetheless, that would be about it for the wireless security. We mentioned two most common attacks on the access points, and we also mentioned what steps you can take to prevent them from happening or to make them less likely to happen. Now, in the next video, let's see a demonstration of one of these attacks and how they look like.